3 days after the fall that shook the entire skating world, Ilia Malinin broke the silence, and what he said was not an apology, and it was not an excuse. He made a statement, a cold, deliberate, carefully constructed statement from a 21-year-old who had spent 72 hours processing the most devastating moment of his athletic life. On February 16, 2026, he opened Instagram and hit send on a post that opened with a highlight reel of gold medals and perfect landings and everything the dream was supposed to look like. Then, smash cut to black, just a photograph of him burying his face in his hands, glory on one side and heartbreak on the other, no filter and no explanation required. The caption hit like a freight train moving at full speed. On the world's biggest stage, the ones who look the toughest are often fighting battles you cannot even see from the outside. He did not stop there, and what followed was not the language of an athlete deflecting blame, but the language of someone diagnosing a systemic failure that had been building for years before Malinin. He wrote that vile online hatred attacks the mind, and fear drags it into the darkness, that you try to hold it together against a mountain of pressure, but it piles up until your life flashes before your eyes. He called what happened in Milan an inevitable crash, not a fluke, not a surprise, not a choke, but an inevitable outcome of everything that had been accumulating on his shoulders for years without release. That word inevitable is the entire key to understanding what he was communicating, because it shifts the frame from a single bad night to a documented, predictable collapse under unsustainable weight. 3 days before this post, fresh off the ice in the immediate aftermath, he had owned it completely, said he blew it, put every ounce of blame on his own shoulders with no deflection whatsoever. 3 days later, he was pointing at something much larger than himself, not to escape accountability, but because he had taken the time to accurately identify what had actually happened and why it had to happen. There is a massive canyon between making an excuse and making a diagnosis, and what Malinin posted on February 16th was a diagnosis written by someone who had finally stopped protecting everyone else from the truth. The signs were visible long before the games if anyone had been paying attention to what he was sharing rather than just tracking his jump content and his training footage and his competition results. Eagle-eyed fans had noticed him reposting TikToks about mental health struggles, about the crushing weight of internet commentary, about the specific feeling of never being good enough no matter what you produce. Even in the immediate aftermath of the Friday disaster, he had shared a brief emotional clip about falling short, raw, unpolished, nothing like the controlled media messaging most athletes deploy in crisis moments. This shadow was not something that materialized on the ice in Milan on a single bad night. It had been following him for a long time before he ever walked out and took that opening pose under the Olympic lights. He had even tried to warn everyone directly, explicitly, on record. In 2025, he told Olympics.com exactly what was happening to him, and the sport collectively looked away and kept asking about the quintuple. The reality he described a year before Milan was staring everyone in the face on February 13th, and the people who had dismissed it had to sit with that knowledge while watching the scores come up on the board. The TikTok comments gave a public window into the specific environment he was navigating every single day as the most technically scrutinized figure skater on the planet, and the volume of it was extraordinary. Endless comments ripping him for missing the quad axel, calling him a fraud, saying he choked when the lights got bright. Faceless accounts delivering verdicts on a human being who had dedicated his entire childhood to the sport. For most elite athletes, there is some psychological distance between the crowd in the arena and the internal experience of competing. The noise is external, the preparation is internal, the separation is manageable.
For the generation of athletes who grew up with smartphones, the separation does not exist in the same way. The crowd follows you home, follows you to practice, follows you into every quiet moment you try to claim. The target on his back was the size of a billboard because every event got compressed into a single question: is he going to land the quad axel? And every answer to that question was immediately consumed and judged by millions. That is not the pressure of athletic competition. That is the pressure of being treated as content, as entertainment, as a machine built to perform specific tricks for the amusement of people who will never understand what the tricks cost. He described in the post-competition press conference what was going through his mind in the seconds before the music started, and the description was not the language of a nervous athlete having a bad night. He talked about old traumas rushing back without warning, said his legs turned to cement and his lungs wouldn't open up, said he felt like a passenger in his own body, watching from somewhere outside himself. That dissociative experience, the feeling of observing yourself rather than inhabiting yourself, is a documented psychological response to acute stress overwhelming the nervous system's capacity to regulate. The online commentary was not a separate variable from the trauma he described. It was the trigger, the thing that had been slowly building the pressure for years until the Olympic moment provided the final weight that collapsed everything. He had been telling the sport that people treat athletes like machines built to dance for their entertainment, but athletes are people, and the mental toll is real and mounting, and eventually it demands to be paid. Friday in Milan was not nerves, it was the levee finally breaking after years of accumulation, and the fact that he could articulate it with that level of clarity 3 days later says something significant about who he actually is. The Monday Instagram post was constructed as a split screen, thrill of victory on the left side, agony of defeat on the right side, and the deliberateness of that visual choice communicated something specific. He was not asking for sympathy for one bad night. He was showing the full picture of what it costs to perform at the level he performs at, inside the environment this sport and this internet have created around elite athletes. Being the chosen one of a generation means every event is a referendum, every score is an autopsy, every stumble is evidence for an argument that thousands of people were waiting to make before the routine even started. The accumulated weight of that, years of it, not weeks, not months, years, is not something that disappears between competitions or gets resolved by landing the jump correctly in the next tournament. It builds and it layers and it mixes with the genuine high-stakes pressure of an Olympic final until the wall he described becomes exactly what he called it, insurmountable, not by lack of talent, but by sheer volume. You cannot pile that much on a human being and then express genuine surprise when the inevitable crash arrives. And the fact that he said inevitable rather than accidental is the most important word in that entire post. What happened between the immediate post-competition statement and the Monday Instagram post was not a change of position. It was the difference between reacting and reflecting, between the heat of the moment and the clarity of 72 hours. Right off the ice, he absorbed everything personally because that is who he is, a competitor who accepts responsibility, who does not immediately deflect, who looks at his own performance first before looking anywhere else. 3 days later, the reflection had produced something more complete and more honest than the immediate reaction, not a retraction of the personal accountability, but an addition of the full context that the personal accountability alone could not capture. 3 days later, the reflection had produced something more complete and more honest than the immediate reaction, not a retraction of the personal accountability, but an addition of the full context that the personal accountability alone could not capture. Most athletes in his position would have stayed with the initial statement, kept their head down, returned to training, and let the narrative dissolve naturally without risking the vulnerability of the fuller truth. He chose the fuller truth at 21 years old, fresh off the most devastating loss of his career, in front of the same digital audience that had contributed to the conditions that produced the crash in the first place. That specific choice, to be publicly vulnerable at the exact moment when vulnerability carries the highest professional and personal cost, takes more courage than any quad axel he has ever attempted in competition. The Internet did exactly what the Internet always does and reversed its energy the moment he reframed the story from failure to survival, from choking to fighting invisible battles that the audience could not see from their seats. The same digital mob that had spent days posting clips of the fall with commentary about choking and frauds and wasted potential came rushing back with a completely different posture and a completely different tone. One fan captured the shift precisely. Ilia is already a hero to someone, and that legacy outweighs gold every single time, regardless of what the scoreboard says at the end of any particular competition. The machine that had been chewing him up for years began attempting to rebuild him within the same news cycle, which is the specific whiplash that defines what it means to exist as a public figure in 2026. His willingness to name the thing that hurt him, to put his name on that diagnosis publicly at the highest point of his professional vulnerability, transformed the narrative from sports story to something that resonated far beyond figure skating. He took the darkest professional moment of his life and converted it into a movement about toxic online behavior and its measurable impact on the mental health of elite athletes who are held to an impossible standard continuously. The World Championships in Prague were already scheduled and already circled on every calendar in figure skating before Milan happened, and the question of whether he would show up to defend his title carried new weight after the post. He was not hiding. The Olympic Gala on February 21st confirmed that immediately, showing up not to apologize and not to perform recovery for the cameras, but to demonstrate that the story was not finished in the way people assumed. The competitive instinct that made him the most technically dominant skater of his generation does not disappear because of one night, does not get erased by one fall, does not dissolve under the weight of online commentary. He had identified the enemy clearly for the first time, not the jump, not the pressure of the Olympics, not his own technical limitations, but the specific psychological environment that had been eating at him for years before Italy. Naming the enemy is the first military advantage in any conflict, and the fighter who knows exactly what he is fighting has a different kind of preparation available than the one who is still trying to identify the source of the damage. Prague was not going to be a redemption arc performed for public consumption. It was going to be the first competition he walked into having done the internal work of actually understanding what had happened and why. The broader conversation his post forced into the open is one that professional sports has been avoiding with remarkable consistency, despite the documented evidence that it needs to happen at an organizational level immediately. Cyberbullying targeting elite athletes is not a peripheral wellness issue. It is a performance variable, a documented psychological stressor that affects the athletes whose performances entire industries are built around and financially dependent upon. Most professionals stay silent about it because vulnerability in competitive environments reads as weakness, and weakness has direct financial consequences through endorsements and contracts and public perception of marketability. He put his name on the line at 21 years old, and in doing so created the kind of public documentation that makes it harder for the sport to continue treating this as an individual athlete's personal problem to manage privately. The quad god did not leave his talent in Milan. He stumbled against a silent killer that nobody in the sport had been willing to name out loud, despite the fact that every athlete in the field was experiencing some version of it. He named it, absorbed the cost of naming it publicly, and walked into the Olympic Gala 5 days after the fall, showing exactly the kind of character that makes people follow an athlete through the difficult chapters, not just the triumphant ones. His story after Milan is not the story of a champion recovering from a loss. It is the story of a 21-year-old who used the most public failure of his career to say something that needed to be said by someone. The sport will watch Prague with the specific attention that follows an athlete who has been publicly vulnerable and is now returning to the arena where vulnerability and performance have to coexist under competitive pressure. What he showed after Milan, the immediate accountability, the 72-hour reflection, the public diagnosis, the Olympic gala appearance, the Prague preparation, is a complete picture of athletic character under genuine stress. He did not collapse into the narrative the internet was constructing for him, and he did not perform a sanitized recovery for the cameras. He processed it authentically and communicated it with the same directness he brings to competition. The quad axle will be there in Prague. The technical program will be rebuilt. The competitive instinct that produced 6 quads in an Olympic final and a grand slam of titles will be fully operational when the music starts. But what he added in the days after Milan, the willingness to be honest about what broke and why, is the thing that separates the athletes history remembers from the ones history records, and the difference between those two things matters permanently.